You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined by Kelly Porter, Assistant Director, Transportation and Public Works for the City of Fort Worth. We talk about the city's incredible growth, its first ever comprehensive transportation plan, and big plans for high-speed rail. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by our super wonderful, terrific, amazing Patreon supporters. We appreciate you all keeping this show and Mondays at the Overhead Wire going. To join this merry band of city wizards and transportation experts, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month gets you some stickers and a handwritten note sent with a cool train station stamp. $10 a month gets you one of our transportation scarves. We've also got some bonus material up there, so check it out if you haven't already. And speaking of scarves, the heavyweight net bike scarf is back in stock. I'm also going to make a concerted effort to make some new designs, but if you want to get one of the Butler bike scarves or the lightweight bike scarf now, visit theoverheadwire.com or support us on Patreon. And if you'd like to support the show in other ways, you can buy books at the bookshop site, bookshop.org/shop/theoverheadwire, or find our Cars Are Cholesterol merch at bit.ly/carsarcholesterol. For anything else, including the Town Planning and Practice audiobook, visit theoverheadwire.com and definitely sign up for the almost 20-year-old daily newsletter. Or you can just keep listening and enjoying the show. We appreciate that too. You can also find us on Blue Sky, Mastodon, Threads, Instagram, Flickr, YouTube, Substack, and LinkedIn if you want to connect, usually at the Overhead Wire, but with Flickr, it's Transit Nerds. Some great stuff coming up, so keep on listening and enjoy the show. A quick note for Patreon supporters. I've set up an ad-free podcast RSS feed at Patreon. This means if you want to listen to the show without ads or promotional episodes in your podcatcher of choice, you can do so by heading over to your Patreon account and getting the feed there. I'll post instructions in the show notes of how to do it. And if you aren't a Patreon supporter, you can do so by going to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Even just $1 a month gets you our podcast free of outside ads. That's patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Kelly Porter, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
Thank you for having me. Looking forward to talking with you today.
Yeah, thanks for being here. Before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, I am originally from Fort Worth, but I did leave for 20 years after high school. Went to Prairie View A&M, did my undergraduate in sociology and geography, and then went up to Philly to do my graduate work in city planning at Penn. Stayed up there for a little bit, came on back to Houston, then worked at the MPO and at a nonprofit for a bit, and then made my way to Austin for 5 years, and then came back to Fort Worth during the pandemic, and I'm still here now, so back home.
Nice. What did you take away from all those other places?
I really enjoyed Philly and feeling kind of, in a way, globally centered by being on the East Coast and being, 6 hours away from Europe and being able to go to New York on a day trip, be an hour from the mountains, an hour from the beach. That was all great. And kind of getting to live my truth as a planner and getting to take transit and ride my bike and, live a very multimodal life in a row house. So that was awesome. Good exposure. Houston, and you being from there, it's something you just have to really be there to appreciate. The diversity of people, thought, food, the free enterprise is something you start to realize how that city works. And it's kind of got this international feel to it in a way, even in ways you wouldn't expect it. And so I adore Houston because it actually, since it's still relatively affordable, was able to give me a good step up into life. And then Austin was fun. It's nice being close to the hill country and access to nature and the music scene and getting to do a lot of good pet bike planning there and regional planning. It was a lot to learn there, and Project Connect was coming up. So that was nice, but also working with some of the suburban communities on some of their kind of transition to want and be a little bit more multimodal, walkable, and also think about their tax base and what they're doing. So I worked with San Marcos and Georgetown on a couple of studies, and now I'm back here in Fort Worth. So I think there was something I could take from every single place that I was, what actually works with Houston. And it doesn't have quote unquote land use zoning, right? But it's got a lot of regulation and what works there, what doesn't work. And so you're able to understand the market pretty well when you get to work in a place like Houston, especially going between Houston, Austin, and Philly. I kind of did learn I'd much rather working in a city that's on the upswing than working in a city, especially Philly had started to rebound by the time I got there, but managing declines a whole lot harder in a different way. And so that was quite neat to me. But even as a child, I lived in the San Jose area in California. So just knowing that there is places where you could play outside all day and not burn up in the heat was nice. But, that was some good exposure as a kid, understanding how different places work and function. And I think one thing that still did me in Prairie View is that when you do go to these places, you want to be able to bring those things that you love back home. And so that's what I'm getting to do now.
When was the first instance where you were like, okay, transportation and city planning is my jam? Like, this is where I want to be.
It's a bit of an unconventional story, but it probably started when I was 4 or 5. So it probably started when my sister was in driver's ed. So she was a little bit older than me. She was in driver's ed. And so I got her handbook and learned all the traffic signs in it. And then that turned into my dad taking me to intersections and hitting the pedestrian light buttons and learning how that worked. And then it turned into a love with maps and learning. He got me a Best Western atlas that they had in the hotels when you would travel from work sometimes. And so I got to learn a lot of the interstate highway system and learn how to get places. And in first grade, they would play a game called Stump Kelly, where they would ask me a city and say, how do you get there from Fort Worth? So, well, how do you get to LA? Well, you get out I-20 to I-10 and this, that, and the other. And so I got that fascination. And my aunt bought me an atlas that was nationwide, Rand McNally 1992 atlas. And so geography and maps became a big passion. And every year for Christmas, I would get a new atlas. My mom and dad got me a Fort Worth Mapsco, which is old school. And then I got a Dallas Mapsco, 1987 and 1985, and actually have them here with me. And so I learned all the roads on how to get around Fort Worth. And then eventually Dallas, when I got the Dallas Mapsco, that love of maps and transportation and roads, being a road geek. Don't tell anybody. But, and then one day I was sitting at a restaurant with a family member and we were looking at all the traffic. We were out in the Fort Worth suburbs in Arlington, and traffic on Cooper Street was just terrible. And she said, Arlington's just got a problem with city planning. I was like 6 years old. I said, what is the city planning you talk about? And from there, I knew I wanted to be a city planner. And then that love of transportation turned into understanding a little bit more about urban design and land use, and then economic development, community development, because really I looked at planning as kind of a tool for using that talent or that passion I had for good in the world. And so from there, I was able to get an internship at TxDOT when I was in high school and learn about roadway materials and stuff, and then doing more community economic development at my time in Prairie View and in the Houston area. And when I got to grad school, since I felt like I got to dibble and dabble with a little bit of urban design, a little bit of economic development stuff, I decided to do environmental planning when I was in grad school as my emphasis. And it's been a passion my whole life. Not great at sports, not a great dancer, but city planning is kind of my jam. So it's not something that I really fell into. It was something I've kind of always wanted to be.
It's so interesting. I love asking the question because I get so many different answers from people, and that's awesome. It's funny because when I was in second or third grade, one of the exercises that you do is we roll out a carpet or mat that you can draw on, and it's a map. So you have to tell your teacher like, oh, how am I going to get to the store? Or how am I going to get here? And so that was like the first thing where I was like, oh, maps. This is cool. This is what I'm interested in. And so I love that you got all those atlases and stuff. And did you ever want to just make maps? Is like, I ended up doing GIS and stuff. Did you ever want to be that person, or did you just like...
I thought of, you don't know what city, it's not like people just tell you city planning or something like that's what you're going to go into, right?
Yeah.
So a lot of it's, are you going to be a civil engineer? Are you going to be a cartographer? People told you different things. So I've been told all those things and was interested. I'm sure you draw your own cities on pieces of paper before. They make very elaborate cities with my micro machines. And so, definitely did GIS when I was in grad school or whatnot, but I knew I didn't want to just stop there with the map making. I really wanted to get into placemaking and into systems and all that. And I think what's interesting, though, my first year at Prairie View, or first semester, I did architecture. And I said, that is too much building and drawing for me. And so I went over to sociology and geography because I wanted to get more into policy and those other things. And so, some people say I was the original GPS because back in the day, people used to call me to ask me how to get places. And so geography, I think, was really kind of my jam, and the policy front in the zoning and how do you actually make something happen? How does this work? There's got to be more than just the vision, but how do you actually get it done? And so that's part of the exciting thing about my job here and kind of how my career has taken me is I've gotten not only into the vision part, but also what are the things that actually make something go vertical or actually impact people's lives in a tangible manner. So it's been part of my journey.
When you tell people that you're a city planner, what's their response?
Well, some people say, like my best friends, they can tell people I'm a city planner, but they can't necessarily say what we do all day. And it's hard to describe what we do all day. I have a close friend that's an architect and interior designer. And one time I said, are you going to help somebody decorate their house? And she says, decorate. It's like, hell, it's been decorated since I was 12. And one day I did a parklet for a nonprofit I was working with, and a business said, "Hey, I like the way you decorated this." I'm like, "It's in decoration. This is urban design." I didn't go totally on them, but yeah, sometimes it's, are you an event planner? Are you an engineer? You get that a lot. It just depends on who you're talking to when, but it's very rarely has it been, oh, so you do zoning and subdivision and transportation planning and project development. The only time I've gotten that is when somebody's like, oh, yeah, because my wife's a city planner or my brother's a city planner. So, yeah, it's not a very well understood field all the time, but people know when it's impacting them.
Yeah. People always ask me, can you fix my city? That's the first question I always get. Can you fix this? Can you fix that transportation problem? Can you fix this thing? And I was like, well,
absolutely.
Maybe.
I wish it was that simple.
For sure. Well, I want to hear about Fort Worth too. Can you tell me a little bit about the area and for folks that may not know, like how the city works in the larger metroplex and the transportation that surrounds it?
Sure. So Fort Worth has for probably most of our lives, Jeff, been one of the fastest growing cities, not the fastest growing city in the country. It is a central city, fourth largest city now in the state of Texas, toggling between 10th, 11th, 12th in the nation. When I was born back in the day, Fort Worth was probably right about 400,000 or so. 1990, 447,619 people. Today, we're over a million people. So, when you grow up in a Houston or Fort Worth, you think growth is normal. Everything flying up around you and the amount of change of especially rural to urban, suburban conversion is like, it's just what happens. It's actually pretty unprecedented in some ways. But, we are a central city in Texas. We anchor Fort Worth in its kind of greater surroundings that we define through our planning process. It's like about 3 million people. So about similar size in Denver or Charlotte. When you add Dallas in the mix, we're about 8 million people. I like to say that because in theory, Houston really is the biggest centered region in the state, but they lump, Fort Worth and Dallas together. And Houstonians have to be some of the worst offenders of when you say I'm from Fort Worth, they say, oh, you're from Dallas.
No,
don't do that.
No. I've never done that. I know better. I know better.
So, we are one of the largest cities in the country. We are also, from a transportation standpoint, a crossroads of several major interstates. So we're also a big freight hub. We have, I believe it's 2 Class 1 railroads through here and 1 short line. We've got also the largest passenger hub for Amtrak in the state of Texas because we are the convergence of the Texas Eagle that turns into Sunset Limited, I think, 3 times a week. And then the Heartland Flyer up to Oklahoma City. And then we have that airport called DFW is ours. And it gets you to 5 continents. So we're a very globally connected city. We are trying to look at ourselves now in this 21st century sense where I think for years before we were born, Fort Worth and Dallas had somewhat of a distinct identity, but over time with the Metroplex, they've grown into kind of one large urban kind of megalopolis. And so now I think we're kind of going back to understanding how we serve as a regional center and a statewide center, but also thinking more broadly on the national and even global stage with that world-class airport that we have, high-speed rail and other things, being connected and being kind of the tip of that mega region. Because I think we know with mega regions especially, you have those trip pairs like Dallas, Fort Worth to Houston, Barcelona, Madrid. Well, how do we play up on that now with high-speed rail? And we've been working through some of that. So we really are thinking about what does Fort Worth become in the 21st century as standing on its own in a way as a true global and national player economically, and then also from a quality of life standpoint.
I had several teammates on my track team in college at UT who were from Fort Worth, and they obviously told me, don't call us Dallas ever, or else we'll smack you.
That's true.
But also just like the culture that they brought with them as well was very different from the folks from Dallas. And I just always found that fascinating that, it was very specific, very focused on that history also of Fort Worth, which is the stockyards and the Chisholm Trail, everything we learned about in 7th grade Texas history. Just, thinking about that as well as a cultural phenomenon, Fort Worth's place in Texas.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you say that because, living in the West Coast and in Philadelphia, and even, going to Houston, we probably have more of a tendency to say, to some degree, our roots are Southern, but they're definitely Western. I had uncles and great-grandpappies that were cowboys and whatnot, which has a very, let's say, very broad breadth of what that means. But certainly we are the gateway to the West. When you go west of Fort Worth, you don't hit another city of our size until Denver and Phoenix. And so it truly is kind of the beginning of that frontier. And so that's part of it. So sure, barbecue, stockyards are part of our culture, but we also have a huge, in kind of the greater Fort Worth area, including the suburbs, we have a huge Laotian population, Pacific Islander population, Vietnamese. Of course, African American, Hispanic Americans, and Latinos of all walks of life, Central America or whatnot are here. So it's definitely a very diverse city. And I believe in the last census, we became more diverse. So we've always been kind of cosmopolitan, especially when you think about like the Asian business district we have out in Arlington to the east of here in the Laotian area, out in the Saginaw area or whatnot. And we're getting our first, I think, H Mart. So there's that. But then you kind of brought that up, growing up here, you got access to the Kimball, to the Carter, and to all these world-class museums as well. That's definitely part of our culture. The Jubilee Theater with its African-American theater shows that it puts on. Grew up in that, had a cousin that was an actor in that. So arts and culture and plays and the theater, the opera, the ballet, we have all that here in Fort Worth. We don't have to go east or south for that. And so that is something that is kind of in our DNA, no matter who you are and where you are, that you had access to arts and culture, and people come all over the world to see our museums and to see our deco downtown. The oil bust in the 80s hit Houston hard. It hit us, but it also preserved a lot of our older buildings as well. And so we actually benefited from having kind of this still very walkable, architecturally interesting downtown in a way. So arts and culture are definitely a big scene as part of that. The modern West is what you'll see it called sometimes. It is a mix of both. And also the fact that the West was a very diverse place with who were cowboys and all that. That's all part of being here. We have a cowgirl museum even. So I think we can challenge some of the typical Western stereotypes to where, yeah, it's part of who we are, but it's also modern and urbane. And we want to keep taking that forward as we continue to develop and grow as hopefully the center of a world-class region.
That's really interesting, especially from a transportation standpoint, because trying to connect all those places that you have, the resources that you have in the city is a really important part of your work, I imagine.
Oh, absolutely. And, put like this, COG, the NCC COG, the North Central Texas Council of Government, their forecast has another 4 million people moving here to the Dallas-Fort Worth area in the next 20, 25 years. And so when you think about that, that's adding the city of Los Angeles to our population, or essentially growing by 50%. And you look to the right of you, add another person. It's pretty much what it is. For every 2 cars you see, another car will be on the road. So at the end of the day, there's no reason of 12 million people that moves all the way with just cars. We're going to have to diversify on how people get around, whether that's through transit, walking, biking, or looking at even at broadband as a form of transportation to be able to bring goods to people, looking at other types of modes, considering freight with that as well. So absolutely connecting those people and goods to markets and to services is going to be incredibly important as we go forward. And there's no way we can just build our way out of adding 4 million people in here with just a one size fits all solution.
There's so much going on in the city right now. There's a streetcar plan, possibly bike shares returning. Panther Island that's a cool name, by the way. It's just like, yes. I've seen it in the news for the last, 5-10 years or so. And every time I see it, I'm like, that's so cool.
There's actually a good story behind the Panther.
I read about it last night. I was like, is that real? Like, did a Panther?
It's a real story, is my understanding. I don't know if there's really a Panther here. Who knows?
It could just be a big cat, too.
It could have been a big cat, could have been a dog, probably
or something.
But the story of the Panther is, I believe a journalist from Dallas came over and said that he saw a panther lying at the steps of the courthouse or laying in the middle of Main Street in the middle of the day. Said Fort Worth is slow, even the Panther's like sleeping in the middle of the street. And so he said, hey, we'll just take that as a W and turn that into Panther City. And so Panther City is one of Cowtown's nicknames, in addition to Funky Town and all these other great nicknames we have. So you'll see Panther Island as one of the developments we're working on. It was something that somebody thought would be an insult from to the east, and we turned that into a positive thing.
What's most exciting to you right now in terms of all these things happening?
Yeah, there's a lot going on. So I think 2 of the biggest things happening right now, the city itself is doing its Moving a Million Master Transportation Plan, which is the city's first ever comprehensive citywide master transportation plan that's going to really revamp our arterial network and really do more with leveraging that with our complete streets policy and tying that into it. In addition to that, looking at our trails and bicycle network, all with that. In addition, you mentioned bike share a minute ago. We have bike share expansion happening under Trinity Metro, our transit agency, but also a lot of our bicycle projects now that are on system are looking at, or on street, are really looking at hardening our bicycle infrastructure. So when we are developing bike lanes, we're trying to make sure they're protected. And we're also looking at our bike lanes as not just bicycle facilities, but also potential facilities for just micromodes in general, whether you're riding a scooter or probably even more importantly, in some cases, can the autonomous food delivery vehicles or grocery delivery vehicles start to use those? So that becomes part of our ongoing infrastructure and getting more use out of that system that everybody can use, and also making sure it's high quality and high comfort for folks. So that's part of Moving a Million, that pet bike freight and roadway component. Transit's incredibly important with that because you can't totally build your way out of congestion with all these people coming to our region and of course, with economic growth or whatnot. So transit will be important to that. The mayor, with her vision, has laid out a path forward to where I think you're referencing the Urban Rail Committee, which brought business leaders together, the transit, the city, the NCT COG, to really think about what a urban starter system focused on kind of streetcar would look like, was kind of the proxy. But really, the report clearly lays out, we really want to look at all modes as part of a comprehensive network and system that's going to make sense for the city of Fort Worth. And so, interesting enough, the timing was really great with that, the mayor kicking that off, because NCT COG, our MPO, is also doing their Transit 2.0 study, which helps the region as a whole, bringing the transit stations together in the cities, really understand, okay, with these 4 million people coming, this is a regional issue. How do we think about how transit is funded, how it's operated, and how it's a usable part of connecting the region around Dallas-Fort Worth as a whole? The funding part's a big conversation as a part of that. And so that's still in discussion. But all these different pieces coming together has been incredibly important to think about what do we end up being. As part of Moving a Million, we're doing kind of a deeper dive into the central area of Fort Worth, where we're calling that Connecting the Core, which is looking at those mobility needs in the downtown area, connecting an area called Butler Place, creating more access to that. That's 40 acres of land that was formerly public housing under, for the most part, one owner right near our downtown. And so how do we provide more access to that to leverage that opportunity to be a great mixed-use development opportunity at that site right near downtown? We're also looking at, when you're thinking about adding in all these new people and jobs, and based on kind of our current plans in Fort Worth, okay, what does our mobility system downtown need to look like from a core capacity standpoint? So we're looking at, of course, new connections across some of our barriers like the river and the railroads. How do we bridge those barriers to either create more access and recreational access to the river to complement our park system here downtown, also service flood control, but also create better connections between the central areas so we're not choked off by congestion. And then also, how does that facilitate pedestrian and bicycle with the right kinds of trips that are actually highly comfortable and safe, to where it's not like you're feeling like a pioneer out on the road trying to make a walk from one district to another around downtown? How do we circulate people around certain areas? And streetcars play a lot of big issues, especially around districts, looping people into, around certain districts. And then from a core capacity standpoint, how do you move that many more people through our downtown and our central area? How do you allocate space? So one thing we found is that there's only so much space that we have at the surface level. And so we are going to have to be thinking about how do we add capacity, additional connections for not only roadways and ped bike, but also transit. Where does it belong? And one of the key things we learned through our Moving a Million work through the first runner outreach is people want time savings. So how do we actually make, if we have transit, how's it time competitive with the rest of the system as well? And so we're learning a lot, and we're still kind of in learning mode, and we're going into kind of conceptual mode now. And we expect to have more solid recommendations sometime later in the summer. But there's some good data points that are kind of coming out of what we're learning through all these processes. We're really actually identifying a lot of our challenges head on and saying, hey, how do we solve it? And something that you'll hear my team say a lot as we're talking to elected officials or whatnot is all the easy projects are done. And so how do we think big and bold about moving people and goods around and through our city? And we have an opportunity to actually learn from other places like Austin, Nashville, and other places that kind of boomed. We're already booming, before we have our big downtown boom, which is already starting to happen. How do we plan for that so transportation isn't the reason why it slows down or can't continue in the way that it needs to evolve?
I loved hearing that about the travel time savings. One of the frustrations I think I've had with streetcar projects around the country, and this is my perspective as somebody who actually helped write a book about building streetcars back in the late 2000s, just the idea that they continue to get stuck in traffic and then they don't provide that travel time savings, and then people look at them a little bit as an albatross. Some cities have been successful with it. I mean, we're seeing Kansas City has been very successful with their line. Portland obviously has been successful with their line, but it also is in mixed traffic. So I think that mixed rail, dedicated lane provisions, especially in downtowns, is really important. And so it's interesting to hear people say that, because we also talk about these projects in terms of economic development, right? And so I think that was one of the big pushes for the study as well, is like, well, how do you, use the transportation system to create economic development? And sometimes it's just actually making sure that people can get places faster so that facilitates the economic development, instead of worrying about how many buildings are going to be built along the corridor, et cetera, like things like that. So I'm interested to see how that turns out for you all, because it's something that's been on my mind quite a lot since we wrote that book and since we've been pushing streetcars in cities around the country.
Yeah, and like I said, we're open to all modes. And another one of our mantras is, in addition to all these projects, everything has its place. And so, city of Fort Worth is pretty big, pretty spread out. So we've got a decent regional rail system that takes you out to the airport and connects Fort Worth to Dallas. We have what we're calling tech-based rapid transit that we're putting out towards the east, along our East Lancaster area. And so part of what we're just trying to grapple with is, well, how do we ensure that transit's competitive? One thing we did ask people too is, hey, would you rather get someplace going 50 miles an hour hitting every red light, or would you rather go someplace getting 35 miles an hour hitting every green light, or 30 miles an hour or whatever, but you get there faster because you're hitting green lights? Everybody goes with the green light one. And so we're trying to think about those things. Something we have to acknowledge here, though, is that in our preliminary analysis, there's only so much capacity we have right now, and we are going to have to add capacity to the system. And it's just a matter of how do we add that? And so thinking about that time savings, especially in a place where, in New York or Chicago, transit a lot of times is going to be faster just because. But here in Fort Worth, when you add in parking and other things, how do you think about the total trip? And so we are going to have to think about that. And I mean, the neat thing about Fort Worth is that, I talked to my mom who, mild-mannered, good old Fort Worth woman, worked at the phone company. She was telling me about her trip to work one day. This is recently, just as we were talking. And she's like, yeah, Kelly, to avoid parking, I would park downtown here at the Tandy lot, because Fort Worth had its own private subway, park at the Tandy lot, take the subway into the Tandy Center. Then I would walk upstairs, take the free bus down Houston Street, because we used to have a free zone with transit downtown, and get to the phone company. I'm like, my mom just completed a multimodal trip. And so how do we think about those things as part of what we're doing? And yeah, economic development and workforce is going to be certainly a big part of it. But how do we learn from other places? And how do we want to improve on that? Do we want the same thing that some of our sister cities like Denver and Portland do with their transit mall downtown, where now they're thinking like, oh my gosh, operationally, how do we deal with this? How do we deal with these short blocks? How do we deal with this? How do we deal with that?
Yeah.
With their success? Or can we build something else that we don't have to deal with that? And so those are some of the trade-offs we're going to have to make on being able to not only build out a system, phase it, and also future-proof it to where it can continue to grow with the city's needs.
Are you telling me that Fort Worth's going to build a subway? Is that what you're telling me?
I did not say that. But I am saying that we used to have a subway.
You did, yes. The Tandy Center subway.
And it was pretty awesome, and we all used it. But I am saying that we're trying to think smart about how we are able to utilize capacity in whatever place it may be. And so one big thing that our mayor is thinking about, we don't have a lot of the O&M costs because our stuff's new. And so we're not hitting that wall like these older legacy systems are. And so how do we think smart about that? How do we think about maintenance? How do we think about sourcing? And how do we think about what's going to be usable to the most people? So we get to ask ourselves those questions. Yeah, we're a later bloomer with some of the urban transit, but we get to learn from a lot of our peers. And we have great partners with our MPO and our transit agency and a really open-minded council to solving different issues.
I was just in Philadelphia for the Impact Conference in October, November, around Halloween. And I did notice that. I noticed the amount of repair and the needs that they had that were different than West Coast cities, than Sunbelt cities. And it's a totally different vibe and a totally different, way of looking at infrastructure. And I'm sure that your way of thinking about it as well comes from being in Philadelphia for a little while from that perspective.
Oh, absolutely. And that goes into something, just thinking in general, the way funding is in Texas, and every state's different in how they fund transit and how we fund our roads even and maintenance and whatnot. And so that's something we're going to be thoughtful about. And so a lot of the story we're telling with this Moving a Million to Connect to the Core study is that land use component that builds that market for varying modes that to be useful also ties back to your tax base, which ties back to your ability to implement and maintain your transportation systems in general. And so part of what we're kind of saying is that, our downtown and certain key areas across the city really needs to perform very well in order for us to continue to be, one of our goals is to be one of the best run cities in the country. And so to maintain a reasonable tax structure and high level services, we're going to have to think about how do we get more taxable value per square foot in the right places so that it's not so cost burdensome to residents that have been here for a very long time and our small businesses that are the backbone of what we do. So it certainly is telling that, hey, what we build and how we grow and develop in certain places definitely impacts our ability to fund everything. And now with the kind of the federal situation, not knowing where that's going to go, having a good locally based plan and a state based plan is really a good thing to have these days to know how we're going to be able to sustain ourselves long term.
I mean, that's where Panther Island, the development there comes in too. I mean, the redevelopment of that space is going to be, whenever that takes off, just intelligently planning that district seems like something that will add to, the tax base, be beneficial for the city, and also just be, kind of a really cool redevelopment project that people can look at from around the world.
I agree with that. I think Panther Island, some of those seeds were planted almost 30 years ago now. And our former assistant city manager and planning director, Fernando Costa, helped kind of prime the pump on a lot of that. And, it's like San Antonio, it's a bit of a water infrastructure and flood infrastructure project. That's the Central City project. And then Panther Island's kind of the urban design and development concept on top of that. And so, it is, I wouldn't call it a second downtown. I call it more of an extension of our central core area. And the cool thing about Fort Worth is with there being 4 million people moving to the greater Dallas-Fort Worth area, and probably at least a third of those moving our side of the metroplex, there is room for everyone. So we don't have to think about cannibalization. So between Panther Island and then the Butler Place work, which I encourage you to go to www.accessbutlerplaceplan.com, I believe is what it is. There's plenty of room to rethink how do we, instead of, as many units going out on the prairies to the north, how do we accommodate for people that may want that type of townhouse or condominium or, urban lifestyle here in the central city that also does things for the tax base. So Panther Island is kind of a visionary thing that kind of blends water management like the Dutch did with also great urban design and a dense urban use. I think Butler Place also brings its own opportunities to better connect Butler Place with downtown, which we're also doing some work in the southeast downtown area that's centered around the convention center expansion, high-speed rail, as well as the new Texas A&M campus. And so there's also opportunities there. So we're really, I think, being very thoughtful and careful about downtown and the areas around it, the central area of the city, really having a prominent future in the city of Fort Worth. And it doesn't mean you're still not going to be able to buy a single family home here. It just means there's going to be additional options. That product that we're building here may not be as readily available. And so with the Panther Islands, the Butler Place, downtown Fort Worth itself, near Southside, West 7th, that's adding to that appeal and those options. And that's really what we're all about here in Texas, is giving people choices and options.
One thing I noticed when I was looking at the Butler Place and I looked at it on the map and I was looking at some of the history and some of the planning processes, I was a little worried though about kind of the strangulation by highway. It is surrounded on 3 sides. And I'm wondering, like, from a public health perspective, how do you develop a property like that that's inside of the highways and, continue to allow people to breathe fresh air with the problems with particulates and the roadways that are surrounding it?
So interestingly enough, that was a public housing site and part of the segregated history. And my dad was actually part of the last class at the I.M. Terrell School there in 1973. Maybe the last segregated class in the city. I'm not quite sure, but certainly the last class that graduated there before they closed it down. So it does have kind of this rich history there, and kids from all over the city went to I.M. Terrell, and then, there's the kids there that lived at Butler Place. But essentially, a lot of that study is to try to right the wrongs, because that public housing that went there, that was kind of part of urban renewal for the neighborhood. Then when the interstate went through, it actually tore down some of the public housing. So it was like double whammy.
Yeah.
And so this is our opportunity to really reconnect that and create more access and kind of think about righting some of those wrongs. And now it's this big opportunity, because it's largely under one landowner, to do better connections there. So yeah, there'll probably be concepts for deck parks and connections over to the river, better connections to downtown with walking, biking, and multimodal or whatnot. Green space is something that our mayor is certainly part of. I'm glad you brought that up, because we have our good natured green space program and open space program here at the city of Fort Worth that's not only looking at areas, to preserve out on the fringes, like with some of our ranches and prairies, but also creating more open space and green space right here in the city center for, certainly flood control, certainly thinking about air quality and environmental quality in general. And so I think we have some real opportunities to bridge some of those gaps and to kind of reconnect some of these spaces and places. I mean, the other thing about Butler Place is cut off from the downtown by the railroads for probably longer than it had even been there. And so now we can even create new connections. So we are looking as part of that planning effort at connecting over to the parks, some of the biggest parks probably in the city, which includes Gateway Park, and then also the connections across the freeways over into downtown. And then transit will also more than likely play somewhat of an important role in there as an amenity for folks that may be living and working there, but also our convention goers and students that, may live across there and then go to conventions or go to the new campus at A&M or down to Texas Wesleyan. down the east side. So there's a lot of opportunity to think about public health with that and bridging some of those gaps. So we are certainly being very cognizant of that. And TxDOT's been a really good partner in helping us look at creating that economic development opportunity at that site.
I wanted to ask you about TxDOT too, because I think that's an interesting discussion about how they operate in terms of like adding capacity to roads and streets and cities, and how the leadership at the state level looks at those things too. I mean, we saw recently in San Antonio where the state basically took back a state road because they were trying to do a road diet on it. And so I know that TxDOT staff is not, the Texas Transportation Commission or the governor of the state of Texas, but that political kind of interference comes into play sometimes when you're talking about maybe creating capacity for bikes and for transit and for more people versus, capacity for more cars.
Yeah, I think here at the city level, we do what we can on our own facilities to accommodate all modes. We try to have a thoughtful approach. I'm not super dogmatic and, hey, every road's got to be on a road diet and we got to do this and the other. I want to think about, how do I safely accommodate people? Mm-hmm. And I think that's where we are. And I think that's where TxDOT is too. They still have a policy where they do accommodate all modes on their facilities, and every entity can think about what that means for them. But we are being very thoughtful in working with TxDOT within their policy on different types of projects. I think, in Dallas, there's good examples of deck parks over some of their roadways, which certainly have helped bridge gaps. If anything, on East Lancaster corridor, we're getting really nice wide sidewalks and shared paths along it to help. And so I think at the end of the day, we're just focusing on how we can partner together to move people across. And I think the big key is focusing on what we can do and can do right. And we're actually, I think, able to do a lot of really cool things to accommodate all people based on that kind of, let's focus on really what we can do and how do we make it the best possible. And TxDOT's been a really good partner in at least listening to ideas and trying to be accommodating. And it also helps having a good MPO. NCTCOG's been absolutely wonderful in helping us not only get things funded and built, but also helping us navigate, how to do things with the different parties at play in our different policy angles.
I also want to ask about high-speed rail. It's a very popular topic, especially in Texas right now. We saw that Amtrak was looking for potential partners to work on this program with. And I'm curious what the feeling is like in Fort Worth and in Dallas about the potential for this project.
So here in Fort Worth, we're gung-ho about Fort Worth to Houston. I'm just going to tell you that we are super excited about Fort Worth to Houston and high-speed rail. And we're really working on our area plans for how do we integrate the potential for high-speed rail in our downtown. And right now, our preferred option is coming underground with high-speed rail. That's our preferred option, but that's in the environmental process with NCTCOG and TxDOT. And so we're already starting to look at how does that serve as a catalyst to where now you've got students at A&M downtown Fort Worth that can take a morning class in Fort Worth and then go back to main campus, take an evening class, and then come back to Fort Worth. Or, if there's ever the expansion down to, Austin, San Antonio, which has also been looked at, and actually to Laredo and Monterey, and then Monterey, Mexico City.
I know, I saw that recently.
So now we're connected to the largest metropolitan area in the continent, in the hemisphere, really. So big vision. So we're super excited about it. It creates a unique opportunity that only a handful of places in the world actually get to have, is that type of mega regional connectivity. And we see ourselves at really what we say is being the Texas nexus for all that wonderful connectivity. We've been, looking at how that really is kind of a new gateway into the city, because then you can connect to TexRail, you connect to the other Amtrak services. We think that one seat ride to Houston is really important, to not have that transfer in Dallas. That's really important. So that's what COG's been working on and trying to figure that out. We think it's important to the region. Something we've had to kind of continue to say is that, although we have commuter rail line that's going to be double tracked between 4th and Dallas, that's not the same as being on the high-speed rail line. It's kind of, as one of my professors at Penn used to say, that sucking sound you hear is all the economic activity going to where that high-speed rail station is. And so we want to make sure that we have it, we're on it. And it just makes sense for us to have it. I mean, we're already the largest Amtrak hub in the state of Texas, so people are already using rail here. The one-seat ride between here and Bryan College Station and Houston is going to be really important. The potential to connect down to Austin, San Antonio, Laredo, Monterey, and then connection over to Mexico City, incredibly important as well. And so we see that being key to us being kind of a 21st century global player. Michael Morris says, that this is our generation's DFW airport. And I tend to agree. I'm sure you've taken high-speed rail in more than one country. I've taken it in Taiwan and Spain. And yeah, I mean, the fact that you can go 350 miles, 2.5 hours between Madrid and Barcelona And they've been able to reduce the amount of air trips between there. Still planes, you can still get on a plane if you want to, but you can also take the train. And it's about finding those options. And it's a different market. And so we've already started doing our planning around there. Even think about, hey, would there be a way that you could get off the train and from Bryan College Station, you had a connection to DFW Airport. And guess what you're able to do is check your bag downtown Fort Worth and get on the text rail and head to the airport and have your check bag there for you. Or, if there was a huge convention happening and essentially the connection between Fort Worth and Dallas would facilitate connections with our convention centers, would you be able to have kind of a multiple location convention and it's connected through high speed rail? I mean, thinking all kinds of big deals, but we see it as not only, added spice to our already, success story, but really key to us being the global player and adding a certain premium. We're totally excited about it. Our council is very supportive of it, and we're doing some planning work around it. Now, the type of planning work we're doing is also accounting for, if it could take a while, we're kind of uncoupling some of these other great multimodal transportation projects and development projects, mixed-use development and other concepts. We're decoupling that from high-speed rail to understanding that these things can happen on their own without a high-speed rail. But one thing we're going to be studying over the summer is what is that factor of premium that high-speed rail adds to that mix.
There's a lot of good research out of China specifically about that, the agglomeration effects and things like that from Chinese high-speed rail, since they've built such a huge network. It's just so exciting. And I think that your travel time thing you mentioned from earlier is the same thing with high-speed rail, right? Is connecting the places where you can go in a very short amount of time. Here in California, I'm in San Francisco. And, that discussion about California high-speed rail, I wish it was faster, but when it's finished, it'll be amazing to get between the places where we want to go. My sister lives in Bakersfield. I'd love to go and visit on a high-speed rail line. And so, making those happen would be amazing. And it's funny because I remember as a kid watching the Southwest Airlines commercials, right? Where it's like they have a clock going and it's like every 20 minutes you miss your flight and you hit your snooze button and you can just get on the next one. And I feel like this is like the real snooze button hitter, right? Like the ability just to hop on a high-speed train between Houston and the Metroplex. And it's just like a huge deal. And I think that it might finally come to pass, which is very exciting.
Yeah. I mean, when you think about 12 million people being in Dallas-Fort Worth and another 12 million people being in Houston, you're going to have something else besides I-45 and I-35 and 287 and Highway 6 and some commuter flights between, 4 airports or 3 airports. It's key to really our success. No other agglomeration of cities this big doesn't have a rail option. California's building theirs. And although people may say what they want to about California, it's happening. It's under construction. And the East Coast, the same thing. And I think it looks like there may be some momentum building between Detroit, Windsor, and Montreal in Canada, kind of starting to be talked about more too. So it is key to the success of moving these large amounts of people from point to point. And when you think about, you being in the Bay Area, a lot of the reason why you have the San Jose Silicon Valley effect and the Berkeley effect was that connectivity and being able to move ideas between places and people and opportunity. And so it's really critical. I mean, essentially, it would not be unreasonable people do it today. They commute from Bakersfield to LA or Modesto to San Jose or Stockton to San Jose. They do it all the time. But it's a whole lot less of a super commute when you add high-speed rail in the mix, especially if it's only a few times a week. So you're absolutely right. And I will say this, even about California, even starting in the Central Valley, Fresno and Bakersfield really aren't small places. So you got to start somewhere. And I think that one good thing about being here in Texas, us both being in Texas, we know when we put our minds to something, we typically get it done. And so I'm really hoping that it happens because, the scale of development and potential, especially from a tax revenue and just a good sustainable tax base standpoint, is light years difference between kind of where we are today from when you do add high-speed rail in the mix. You're talking about there's interesting like a Denver Union Station, which is phenomenal with Amtrak and commuter rail, versus a Hudson Yards when you start to throw in high-speed rail and real connectivity through it. So we do need to think about that. And I think the thing in Fort Worth is density in the right places are going to make sense in the Metroplex. And I think that helps create that framework for density and economic activity in the right places.
It's such a difference than the airport, right? Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport is huge, but it's also in the center in between the two. And it's spawned, basically, it feels like, a whole set of suburbs around it as well because of the, number of people that probably work there and the access that it has. But high-speed rail is something different. It goes into the downtown and it connects people that way. And so I think that's really fascinating too. I did want to ask you a question about freight too, because I think that's really interesting. When I was in grad school, I went to Hazlitt and we did a presentation on the possibilities of future TOD. This was in like 2002. 2005 actually, maybe it was. And it's, it's a small town, but it's right outside of Alliance, Texas, the freight logistics center up there. And so I'm wondering about how that plays into your transportation plans too, because that's such a huge thing now, is the discussion about freight and moving goods and services and the e-commerce of it all. And so I'm curious how that plays into some of the discussions that you're having about transportation in Fort Worth.
Yeah, freight's a big part of our economy. And frankly, most of us are consumers in some way and have grown to enjoy the on-demand lifestyle of getting something delivered to your door or whatnot. But a lot of what we're thinking about with freight, and as we're talking about transportation in general, a lot of what we're talking about high-speed rail. And even if we're talking about, dedicated guideways and energy use of modes and stuff, it's all technology, right? And so freight, we're really thinking about it from a standpoint of really multimodal. So, you've got our really good rail infrastructure in the Alliance area in the north side of Fort Worth. You've got the rail infrastructure and interstate infrastructure, and then you've also got the airport infrastructure. All those things are key. So we're working a lot with our partner out there, Hillwood, that has done a lot of the development around that area on how do we move people and goods. Some of it's coming through Fort Worth. Some of it's being drayaged and offloaded onto other modes, like from, rail from the port to a plane or to a truck or whatnot. So we're thinking through that. We're thinking about automation a lot with that. And so we have a big project that we're working at with Hazlitt and NCT COG and TxDOT on kind of work on the smart port connector zone, some our mobility innovation zone, where we're really thinking about the managed lanes on I-35 and how those could be used potentially and on Highway 170 to be able to, kind of start to pilot platooning freight in those corridors. And then we worked with a company called Cavnu that is setting up dedicated lanes on one of our arterials that will connect from flyovers off of 170 that partners just got a build grant for to connect them onto these autonomous vehicle lanes. Some of the first in the country, not the first, but some that would then connect you into like the Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railroad Terminal and the airport and all that other stuff. So automation is a big part of it. Part of what we've acknowledged is, although we think we have a ton of land, we have a lot of land, but an efficient use of it is, in that kind of more constrained zone. Because probably when you went out there, just like when I went out there when I was a kid, it was the country.
It was,
and
yeah. It felt like the country.
Warehouses and railroads. So land's not like it used to be anymore. And so how do we use automation as a way to get more out of the system? And so that's the only way we can really grow capacity there for our growing needs in our region is using automation, whether it's, in the warehouses itself, whether it's containing heavy freight to a certain zone that stays within that zone between the rail and the warehouses and going to smaller vehicles. There's also a private bridge that's being constructed to connect the rail zone over to the land side of things as well. And that automation will be really important. And that's also a safety benefit. And then on the urban side is every little autonomous, like food delivery vehicle. I don't know exactly what we want to call them, little micro vehicles that are delivering food or groceries to people. It's not a truck or a car on my roadway. And so that's another way to add space and use our capacity better and provide actually services to people. So if now you're in a food desert and you've got good broadband, which I've kind of talked about that being a transportation mode, now we can get you either seen by a doctor virtually, or you can get something delivered to your house and you're in this food desert. Now you get groceries delivered to your house with this micro vehicle that's using what was a bicycle lane is now a green lane or something. Same thing that can get something over to your house. And so we're thinking about freight from a nationwide and international supply chain component to also recognizing that in many cases, big trucks don't necessarily belong in cities in the same way. Other things is how do you break those up into smaller vehicles that then can make the deliveries, and how do we use our curb space differently? So I can keep going on and on and on about all the ways we're going to look at freight, but heavy freight's a big part of this, and the logistics and goods movement and passing through and rail side and air side and all that stuff. And then also the delivery component. And so I'm actually learning a lot about that because that's not stuff they teach us in planning school generally.
No, but it's real.
But kind of breaking it down to where as it comes into the city, we're going to have to be on smaller vehicles. We're going to have to think about time of day as well with deliveries eventually, and our curb space, because curb space is a big thing we talk about in the business now, and just factoring in how do all those things fit together. And that's helping us utilize our space better. So we are not forgetting that freight is critical to our economy and just critical to quality of life.
Last question for you. What are you looking forward to the most?
Well, I mean, high speed rail is really exciting. If I just had to pick a project, that is super duper exciting and geeky because it has all these other great externalities with it or whatnot. But, I just feel honored to be able to do this type of work with my hometown and really see it continue to come into its own as it continues to evolve. I'm excited that this is the city's first ever master transportation plan that I'm getting to work on. So there's some selfish excitement, nerdy excitement into that. But I am excited to see what innovations we come up with. And I think Fort Worth has an interesting opportunity to be the city that, we had to have an historic center that was built around walking and biking and things like that, like most cities were. And then, but for the most part, we're a fairly auto-oriented place. I think I'm excited to see how we balance that formula of creating more options on how people get around, selling walkability and multimodality as options and freedom. How does that show up in our city? And really seeing what impacts that has. So it may not be wholesale, quote unquote, suburban retrofitting, but hey, in some of these underperforming areas that are overparked, how do we actually look at creating more walkability and those become denser nodes that can connect into the existing neighborhoods that may be single family that people have had vested interest in? We're preserving that, but we're also able to build density in the right places. I'm excited to have that conversation and to build policy around providing more options for people than feeling like people are forced to do anything. So I think it's an exciting conversation to have. And the fact that we're doing the planning now is really exciting to think about what we want to be and how we want to be, and centering it really around the freedom to be able to move and to travel in various ways, which is really what we all want.
Yeah. Where can folks find out more about what you're working on?
So I really highly suggest they go to our hub site, which is www.movingamillion.org. All of the planning work that we're doing now is on that webpage, from the citywide master transportation plan to the connected core study, to the Access Butler Place work, to the Berry Street work. We did some corridor plan on Berry Street. We're also working on a corridor plan on McCart Avenue, which is kind of a more suburban arterial. The cool thing I wanted to mention to you, Jeff, is that, like with Berry Street and with McCart, we're also not only looking to rebuild those corridors as more, multimodal in nature, but we're also doing the form-based code with them. So those are cool capital projects. So we're actually doing the zoning with it as part of the process and also doing thoroughfare plan amendments. So it's the complete package. It's not just the pretty plan with watercolors. It's actually the full package of policy that goes to create more of that walkable, mixed-use, more economically vibrant environments, while also preserving some of the neighborhoods around them. So it's kind of exciting. But all that can be found on our city's Moving a Million website, or for like the 2050 comp plan that we're working on, comprehensive plan and other things. I believe it's connectfortworth.com.
Awesome. And where can folks find you if you wish to be found?
Well, it's pretty easy. It's LinkedIn. I'm on X and Blue Sky, but I'm pretty quiet on those, I'd say. But I'd certainly say LinkedIn. And then they can get me at transportation@fortworthtexas.gov. That's where my whole team has access to the emails. We all look at that inbox right there, and we'll be able to get back with you.
Awesome. Well, Kelly, thanks for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. It's great to talk to a fellow Texan and nerd out.
Thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of the Overhead Wire and appears first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our generous Patreon supporters for supporting this show and Mondays at the Overhead Wire. You can support the show by going to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Sign up for our 18-year-old daily newsletter by visiting theoverheadwire.com, or check the show notes for other cool merch and opportunities to connect. Follow along using your podcatcher of choice, but if you can't find it there, you can always find the show at its original home, usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Headways.